Yeah. Yeah.
Welcome to the Into the Wilderness podcast. I am your host, Byron Pace. It is the 3rd of September 2020. It's the 3rd of September. How did September come around so quickly? I'm recording this actually in my hotel room. I'm in London right now, so you'll have to excuse me if the intro is not up to the usual audio quality standards because I'm on my remote gear. I've been working on a film project here in London all week, and eventually I fly home on Saturday. But it's kind of nice to have a camera in my hand again. I haven't made any films or done a whole heap of photography for the last few months, mainly because the world has been locked down. I haven't been traveling, and I've actually been using my time to work on my house, which is something I haven't had time to do for the last couple of years. So I am thankful for that. But anyway, into this show. First up, a big thank you to my top-tier Patreon supporters, which this week include Richard Stevens, Richard McNeil, Ronnie Speakman of rdcontracting.co.uk, Tom McCraith, James Benjamin Normandale, James Marchington, the guys at South Esher Stalking, Josh Starling, Thomas Cameron, and Mark Zabrowski. But also a really heartfelt thank you to all the other Patreon supporters. I've had a handful in the last 2 weeks, which are not top tier supporters, and so you don't get your name mentioned. I do send you some swag, but it really makes a difference when I get that support in, even if it's just $1 a month. It gives me that sort of push to keep doing this. Believe it or not, it may seem like a small amount, and it's almost like beyond the monetary value. It just gives me the enthusiasm to keep putting this podcast out there. So thank you very much if you've joined recently, and thank you so much if you've supported the podcast for a long time. If you would like to support the podcast, head over to patreon.com/Byron Pace. Just my name, /Byron Pace. 2 weeks ago, I ran a competition, as we do on all of the long-form podcast episodes. For those of you who've been listening long enough, you will know that. And that is to win a copy of Modern Huntsman, who, of course, are our partners on this podcast. And in fact, without the support of the Patreons and Modern Huntsman, these shows wouldn't exist, because I quite simply wouldn't have the time to do this. I'd have to go and do other things, make more films, do more photography. I love bringing these podcasts to people because I really enjoy having deep and meaningful conversations with awesome people from around the world. So I asked you to simply go and follow my Instagram page, which is at Byron J. Pace. And I picked somebody who followed in the last 2 weeks. And the winner, picked at random from the people who followed the page in the last 2 weeks, is Jess McLaughlin. I had to say your surname probably 4 or 5 times and edit it out because I just kept on fumbling it. But hopefully I haven't messed it up. McLaughlin, which is Jess McLaughlin Media on Instagram. Congratulations. You get your choice of Modern Huntsman volumes 1 through to 5. However, volume 5 is actually out of stock both here in the UK and in the States. So if you want to get a copy of volume 5, then you will have to wait until we do a print run, which is going to be very, very soon. But 1 through to 4 is sitting, waiting to be shipped out. If you'd like to order a copy, and if you want one of those copies, Jess, I'll be able to get those out to you as soon as you contact me. And you can get hold of me, podcast@paceproductionsuk.com. Of course, we're going to be running another competition because I know all of you would like to get your hands on a copy of Modern Huntsman. I'm going to run this competition on Twitter, which is not something I think I've ever done before, because historically I wasn't much of a Twitter user, although I have been using it a lot more. In fact, I kind of talked down Twitter for many years, but I found it a really good way for me to consume news if I'm following a select number of the right Twitter accounts. So I kind of use it as a news feed. I use a couple of things for a news feed, but Twitter has become one of those things where it's been really useful. And in fact, some of the podcast guests that we've had on over the last month or two have come from people who I've been introduced to on Twitter. So head over to @ByronJPace if you're a Twitter user, and hit me up with a comment, share the podcast. Just let me know that you're interacting in some way. And anyone who does that in the next 2 weeks, I'll enter you into a randomly selected list of people who will be in with a chance to win your choice of Modern Huntsman. And if you want to find out more about the Modern Huntsman publication, head over to modernhuntsman.com. In fact, actually, the day after this podcast goes out, my first online contribution for the publication will be going live, which is going to be a brand new monthly column that I'm going to be writing. And it's all focused on conservation and the environment and ecology. It's taking a deep dive into articles and media that's out there that I think makes for essential reading. It's us trying to point to other great work that's out there. And I consume a lot of this on a weekly basis, so I just want to share it with everybody else. And you'll be able to find that on the Modern Huntsman website. So that's modernhuntsman.com. And so into this week's show. I sit down virtually and have a chat with Mansal Denton, who I actually connected with over Instagram maybe 2 months ago, 3 months ago. And eventually we got on the phone together and hooked up this podcast. This is a really deep dive spiritual conversation in many ways, and one that I thoroughly enjoyed having with Mansal. And so I don't want to hold you up anymore, because this is a really fascinating conversation with somebody who has a truly unique and gripping story that I think everybody who listens to this show will be able to find some inspiration from. So without any further delay, I bring you Mansal Denton. Mansal, welcome to the Into the Wilderness podcast. How are you doing today?
Well, I'm looking out at a beautiful red oak tree at a friend's house, and that always makes me feel happy.
Well, that's a lot better than my view, because I'm looking at a white wall and a TV screen that's off in a hotel in the middle of London right now, which is not my normal kind of environment, but I happen to be in London working this week, and with my evenings relatively free after like a whole day of filming. So that's how we managed to tie up this time. So your view beats mine.
I'll take the win.
So what's the last couple of weeks been like for you? What state am I speaking to you in? Because you are over in America, but whereabouts in America?
Yeah, I live in Texas, and until about a week ago, I was living in Austin, Texas. Now I am having a brief stint in Dripping Springs, Texas, which for anybody who knows the geography, it's about 20 to 35 minutes west of Austin. So still close to the big city, but I'm out on 25 acres and enjoying some deepening of my relationship with nature and that land specifically.
Tremendous. So what prompted the move? Was it just to be out of the city?
Well, honestly, it was a lot of serendipity. I have a very close friend who I met doing some medicine work, specific entheogen called ayahuasca, and he has always been close to me. He lets me hunt on his property, and that 25
Okay.
acres, that's where I've hunted for the past 2 years. That's where I've done other different ceremonies and things like that. And he just had you can call it a spiritual experience, doing some breath work where he was given some message that he needed to invite me to come live with him for free. And he has a huge house. His kids are all out of the house. I mean, it's a enormous opportunity, and I was really grateful that I was given the opportunity, even for just a short period, because it's a really special place. And I was already looking to kind of simplify, and this year I've got, I'm going to be gone for 40% of the fall and winter, just either facilitating hunts or hunting myself. So having kind of a home base that I wasn't paying rent to nowhere felt like a really great opportunity.
Fantastic. So you already have a packed season ahead of you by the sound of it.
Yes, very packed, and I'm both excited and a little anxious about how it will turn out and how people will enjoy the experiences, but it's part of it.
So I guess if I ask you about that, I'm kind of missing a whole heap of background. So we'll get to the hunts that you're running because I'm assuming you're doing it with clients, are you?
Yes, yeah, I'm doing it
Yeah.
with the client.
Okay. Cool. So let's get to that. But before we get to that, you didn't take up hunting all that long ago, did you?
No, it was at this point now only 2.5 years ago that I had my first hunting experience.
Well, that's really not that long ago. So how and why? What facilitated it? Because do you mind me asking how old you are?
I'm 29.
You're 29, so like it's not late to come to hunting. You know, there's plenty of people who come like literally in the middle age, but it's out with the what a lot of people would consider a kind of a normal routine, which is that you're taught how to do it either by your parents or your grandparents from a young age. It's maybe a little bit more common, say, in the last decade with this move towards people who are more conscious about where their food comes from. I hate to use the phrase, but the kind of the evolution of the hipster hunter. I mean, I embrace it. Not that I would really class myself as one, but I embrace everybody who wants to, see what this world is about and try and understand their food better. So I don't say it in a derogatory term, but that has pulled a lot of people in of probably the age that you and I are now. So what was your journey into it?
Great question. And I do resonate in some way, not at all with the term hipster, mostly because I live in Austin, Texas, which is drowning in hipsters. But I do resonate with the initial call being a closer connection with my food. And strangely enough, I was raised a vegetarian or de facto vegetarian because my mother is from India. She essentially cooked every meal in my childhood, and because of that, I tried different meat products, but I, generally speaking, was vegetarian. And when I got into my 20s and started to play highly competitive soccer, I played in Europe for a couple of years. I came back to the States and played, and I realized how much better I felt eating meat. And that kind of segued into my questioning around where I'm sourcing my meat and why I have this perception that meat comes from grocery stores and from restaurants. And so there was definitely a piece in my journey that was related to the food, but there was this whole other side of the story where, and we can go into this if you like, but when I was 19, 20 years old, I behaved like most young males poorly and ended up arrested and convicted and had a felony on my record. I spent time
Oh,
in
wow.
prison when I was 24 years old for about 6 months. And so after those experiences, in retrospect, it was a rite of passage. It was a time period for me where I was forced to go from kind of an aloof, ignorant boy to a man who could, survive the challenges of prison. And in that journey, I had a lot of questions about what it meant to be a man, what it meant to be the most moral, the most self-developed, self-actualized person that I could be. And I turned to many different practices, and hunting was on the list somewhere in my mid-20s. So I think 27 or so is when I decided that I was going to go hunting for the first time. And I like to believe that there was some more cosmic plan behind it, because when I wanted to hunt, because I was a felon, technically I wasn't allowed to use a rifle, and so I went straight into archery hunting. And it provided such a intimate experience, a far more committed practice, that it really encouraged me to fall in love with the practice more than I would have if I would have just, hunted with a rifle.
Wow, that's amazing. Do you mind if we, and I ask this question because I wonder whether there's anyone listening to the podcast who is either in a phase of their life where they maybe feel like they're losing their way, either just that they don't quite know what their purpose is, or maybe that they've found themselves in a very difficult situation, maybe even brushing up against the law. What was the sort of chain of events and circumstances that got you to being imprisoned? Given the little that I know about you today, it almost seems like how did that happen to this person that I see before me now, when you were a young man?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it has a lot of it parallels, or it is involved in my hunting practice. It's involved, I think, for a lot of people who are probably feeling similar or have felt similar in their life. When I was growing up, I felt a pretty big disconnect between what it meant to be a man, what were the definitions, what were the practices, how did we embody it? And my father, did the best he could, but he didn't impart the wisdom that in retrospect I would have wanted. And some of the things that many men, and definitely was the case for me, pick up in the absence of a strong, masculine role model is relationships with women being some kind of definition or defining factor in masculinity. And for me, there was definitely growing up a lot of shame around the fact that I'm not fully white, but I was primarily living in an upper middle class, white neighborhood in Texas. And there was inferiority feelings, there was insecurities, and it all culminated in essentially a woman that I had a relationship with briefly. She moved back home to Switzerland, and in my yearning to feel loved and my insecurity to be loved, I was working in a museum and I stole historical documents out of the museum when I was 18, 19 years old. I sold the documents and I used that money to go be with her in Europe.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was
a crime of passion.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
And it took me a long time it took me going to prison for 6 months. It took me 4 years, 5 years after the fact for me to reflect on and grow through my own insecurities, my own shadow, if you will, if you're familiar with Jungian archetypes, in order to identify that it was coming from a place of insecurity, it was coming from a place of shame, it was coming from some wound. And I think it's a wound that a lot of young adolescent males feel, especially given how few rites of passage, how few strong, healthy role models of masculinity there are.
This seems like a kind of a trite question, given the depth of the answer that you've just given me, but I am curious as to how on earth you got caught.
Well, they kept a pretty good log of things, even though I naively believed that they didn't. And so I actually spent 2 years in Europe. And then when I came back, they were not waiting for me at the airport, but they were waiting for me right before I left to go back to Europe from that trip. They raided the house. They came with, dozens and dozens of different FBI, local police, Texas Rangers. It was pretty intense experience for a 19-year-old.
Jeez, wow. And what when something like that happens, what runs through your mind? You obviously knew why they were there because you knew that you just got away with it for the last 2 years. But what is running through your mind with regard to your future at that point? Or was that not a place in your life where you were really projecting forward about the kind of person you want to be?
I did project forward, but I had a path that included history and included many of the things that I actually still have an interest in, but in a very different capacity. There was almost no self-starting, at least as far as my future was concerned. I didn't really have much of a self-starting attitude. I didn't have much of an entrepreneurial attitude. I didn't have much of a thought that I would be in any kind of business or any opportunity like that. I really just wanted to either go into the Foreign Service or the Peace Corps or do some kind of study of history. And I believed that all of that was ruined. I believed that I definitely had a fear that people would not want to hire me. People would not want me to work with them because of this felony. And a lot of things came up, but shock was amongst them. And there was a period for sure after I was initially arrested where one of my darkest moments, I remember I was living with my parents. I had no money. I couldn't go back to school because the semester had already started. I didn't have a job. I basically would binge watch TV and eat pretty terrible food. And I can distinctly remember that desire to escape my reality through TV. So it was a challenging time, and it was a very confronting time because I had led a pretty relaxed and luxurious upper middle class life. The thought or the prospect, the shame, the embarrassment of this arrest, and it was very public. It was in the news. I had friends reaching out to me. It was even worse.
Wow. And what was it that I mean, I know it wasn't a particularly long period of time that you actually spent in prison, but I can't even imagine that short a time being in that kind of confinement with the lack of freedom. What was it that carried you through, and how did your sort of mind reset to pick yourself up once you eventually got out again?
Well, my prison experience was split into two very distinct sections. And my first half of my experience, so I was there for 6 months. The first 3 months were so much resistance. I felt like a victim. I felt disempowered. I would go back to the habit of, watching TV and movies in order to pass the time, eating poorly as much as I could, find sweets and things like that in prison. And I remember a moment, and this is probably the rock bottom moment of my life, but I was speaking with my family on the phone. My lawyer essentially said, even though he thought I was going to get out sometime after 3 months, he didn't really know what was going to happen. My mother told me that my grandfather probably was going to die of cancer before I could see him again. And my sisters were too young to really understand that I was in prison, but they missed me. And there was a lot of sadness in the whole family. And I remember just going to my bunk, putting the blanket over my head, and even though it's not something you're supposed to do in prison, I just started crying and kind of kept it quiet to myself. But it was such a hopeless experience for me, and had some really beautiful support that came from people in prison that I wouldn't have expected it from prior judgments. Yeah, this one guy who was in prison for gun charges and pimping. He literally just he just tapped me on the back and was like, "Head up, keep your head up." Little acts of kindness like that. I remember when my judgments would have me not consider them to be so sentimental. But the second 3 months of my experience were completely different. I don't know what it was. Perhaps a huge part of it was my upbringing. My parents are, for all their flaws, they did a great job raising me. It was a lot of my privilege. It was a lot of some other divine intervention, and perhaps some of my own personality. But I woke up the next morning and I just decided that I did not have control of many things, but what I did have control of, I was going to own fully. So I started fasting. I started working out pretty much every day, and I went to the library, and instead of, watching TV, I was reading the Bhagavad Gita. I was reading Flow. I was reading The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. I was just reading anything and everything that would help me improve my philosophy, my outlook on life. And my whole experience in the second half of prison changed, and it was a very freeing experience, and it was a very empowering experience, because I walked away and I still have a very strong sense of confidence in myself. If I can survive that, if I can control my mind regardless of the situation externally, then I have a certain level of agency. I might not have freedom, I might not have power, but I definitely have agency. And that is a huge takeaway that I've had when I got out of prison, that I've had since then, and it served me well.
Were you able to kind of relate to anybody within the prison system? From the outside, and I gather what I know of American prison systems by what I watch on TV and what I've read. It doesn't look like the kind of place that you ever want to find yourself in. And I'm intrigued, and the reason I probe this question is just because of the small insight that you already gave me behind this character who tapped you on the back and said, keep your head up. What was your experience of the people within the system that you interacted with?
Well, obviously there are really heavy, like supermax prisons, but by and large, I was in the general population with pretty much everybody else for a long period. And there's a lot more camaraderie and shared experience, shared trauma, if you will, than any of the shows make it seem. We all are there against our will. We all have some level of trauma, some shame, some guilt, in some cases, denial, whatever it is. There's shadow in all of us that is in need of healing and support. And we're all, to put it more simply, in a shitty situation. And there's a certain level of camaraderie that comes from that. I even had, for some time afterwards, a little bit of nostalgia around how closely you connect with other people. And in some ways, how supportive everybody kind of has to be. It's a lot more communal. If you think about some of the things that might have showed up in hunter-gatherer societies, indigenous people, some of those tend to show up for better and for worse. There's definitely, issues of violence and, factionalism, but by and large, the rule is, if you don't seek trouble, you're not going to find any. And I was obviously very clear with people, like, I don't want any trouble. I don't want to join anything. I just want to do my time and get the heck out of here. And because of that, I tended to have a lot of common humanity. I was also really very excited by and passionate about fitness and health and things like that. Before I even went to prison, I had started multiple businesses in the health and fitness space before I was in prison. In fact, I was actually managing some of them while I was in prison. And because of that, I just had a certain knowledge and prowess where they would call me, doctor, or they would call me professor, as kind of a loving terminology. And I showed them different ways of working out. I showed them different ways of eating. I educated them in certain ways. And so they had a lot of respect for me, and it generally was...
It worked in your favor.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Were you offered any kind of supportive rehabilitation during that time, or is this sort of new finding of who you are, was that completely of your own fruition?
Well, at some level, I was afforded some luxuries that other people weren't, because I was a white collar crime. It was nonviolent. It was I guess, how they treat the judicial system's a little bit biased. And because it was nonviolent and white collar, they allowed me to work in the library. And you have jobs. Everybody has a job. Some people are in the kitchen, etc. Because I had a college degree, they put me in the library. And that was a huge blessing. That it required me to invest time and to take the opportunity to read the books that were going to be impactful for me, to help me grow. But it was also a luxury, a privilege that was afforded me. And as far as my personality was concerned, I did get lucky that I was arrested 4 years before I went to prison. So I had an initial jolt to wake me up to the type of person that I was, the type of behavior that I was exhibiting. And in that 4-year period, I grew a lot. I went to do like 10-day meditation retreats. I started my own businesses. Entrepreneurship comes with its own challenges that help with personal growth. And so I'd already taken a few steps on the path. Going to prison kind of brought me a few steps backwards, but I had some basis there already that I could draw upon when I was ready to stop resisting and just surrender to the experience.
Amazing. So you're out now. What was the life in front of you as you stepped out of prison?
Well, it was in many ways felt pretty bleak. The business that I had started was doing great. I mean, 6 figures a month, and it was essentially taken from underneath me because I didn't have any leverage or anything while I was in prison. So kind of got that taken from me. I didn't have a place to live. I wanted to live in Austin, but I was back in my hometown of San Antonio, which came with its own weight. So I still had a lot of shame from going to prison in the first place. So it was tough. It was tough to come out the first month or two, but I slowly started to gain momentum, slowly started to use the same tools that I had when I was in prison at the end. Although it was jarring, it was much easier for me, obviously, to seize on my personal growth. And I was able to, do some very specific work called the Mankind Project, doing some men's work, doing some other practices. I started jujitsu. So I was able, was afforded a lot of opportunities to engage in practices and facilitated containers, if you will, for more of my own growth. But, I had a certain level of confidence in my abilities financially, in my abilities business-wise, but it was pretty bleak nonetheless, getting dropped off at, I think it was 11 p.m. I got out, my dad picked me up, and I just go home and I feel like eating every unhealthy thing in the place because I've been eating nonsense for 6 months.
Yeah, just looking for that comfort. What was the conversation with your dad like in the car like after you got out?
Well, there was some hard conversations at the beginning. There were some challenging conversations all throughout the experience. But after 4 years, a lot of money, a lot of tears, a lot of hardship, honestly, my whole family grew a lot closer together. And we're still very close for that reason. They rallied around me. They very much felt like our son made a mistake, but it's our job to support him. He's obviously, seeking a better outlook on life and a better way of behaving in the world. And so generally it was just happiness that I was back, that I was out, and that I was safe. I think for parents, especially watching some of the same things that you watch, there's a fear that their son might be in
I don't make a
danger.
habit of watching them, but I have obviously every second TV show that's on the screen here shows you an insight, and especially an American prison seemed to be a favorite place to pick, which is why I brought that up. So I'm just trying to work out the timeline here now. So you were arrested at 19, but 4 years, and then you did your time. So how old are you by the time you came out?
When I came out, I was 24 years old and went in 23, came out at 24. And then there was a pretty quick growth curve after I got out of prison. And, it was only 2 to 3 years after that hunting became a reality for me.
Okay. So talk to me about that journey, because it's one thing deciding, hey, I want to try this. It's another thing actually finding the route to go and do it. Did you have mentors? Was there any other catalyst that took you down that road apart from a curiosity about being more responsible for your food?
There was, I think that I had, like many men, I had seated in my awareness, my consciousness, was people like Joe Rogan or any of the other more public figures that were speaking about hunting. I was in the health and fitness space. It's so tangential. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with Aubrey Marcus, but
Yeah, he's been on Joe's podcast a few times.
yeah, exactly. And so I had met with him, and I had a lot of connection with the psychedelics and the nootropic side of things. And one day I just saw Ben Greenfield, who's another one in that space, he was a colleague at the time. I just saw that he had hunted and he had a guide, and I just asked him for an introduction to his guide. And that was kind of the catalyst, was just following the next step. It's just like when you're hunting and tracking, you just kind of find the next footprint and find the next one. And you're not thinking too far ahead. You're just kind of paying attention and finding the next one. And that's kind of how it went. It was honestly a lot of naivete in how I approached it, but it worked out.
So where did you go for your first experience of hunting?
Well, my first,
because you must have to do it, because you said you picked up a bow, which it's not like a rifle. You can get comfortable with a rifle. You can be comfortable enough with a rifle to hunt ethically pretty quickly, but a bow takes a little bit longer.
Yeah. Well, this is where the story starts to become a little bit more mystical in my meaning-making machine of my mind.
Okay, I'm all for meaning making. It's important. We all need to meaning make in our lives.
Yeah. So what happened was I had this bow hunt that was on the schedule. It was for early December. I was going to hunt in the Texas Hill Country. Pretty standard hunt for white-tailed deer, hunting from a blind on a feeder. Felt like, as a clueless beginner, that was a good place to start. No problems with that. And I was, at the same time, very accidentally, decided to go with a group of, I think it was 12 men to basically a men's ayahuasca retreat. And so, for those who don't know, ayahuasca is a very it's one of the most potent psychedelic brews. It is made in the jungle. It's been used for thousands of years. Many of the people in the jungle use it for visions, for entheogen means connecting to higher power, and also they use it to hunt oftentimes in the jungle.
It's a root, is it?
It's a vine, and it's combined with many different admixtures, but chacruna leaves are the common admixture, and that's what creates this DMT-based psychedelic compound. But I went to do this men's retreat, and the first night was incredibly profound. And at one point in the experience, I remembered thinking or seeing the deer that I was going to hunt in my mind's eye. And in that emotional, altered state of consciousness, I just started crying, thinking about the fact that I was going to kill that animal. As someone who had never done it before, it was a pretty intense new reality. And for the first time ever in my life, because I grew up, my parents were very scientifically minded. They both had PhDs. I had zero relationship with religion or higher power or anything like that. And in that moment, with tears streaming down my face, I just asked God, universe, whatever, please allow my arrow to go straight through the heart of the animal and kill it as quickly and as painlessly as possible. And as part of that experience, I went back home, and for a month, I practiced rigorously, knowing that God was not going to make it happen. I had to do it myself, or I had to at least was a 50-50 split. I got to do my part. And so I did that. I went on the hunt, and for many days had opportunities, but didn't take the shot. And then the second to last day, I had an opportunity, took the shot, and to everyone, including the guide's amazement, the arrow went straight through the heart. And at this point now, facilitating other people, I think it's quite a common story. There's something a little mystical that goes on with people's first shots. But to me, I felt in many ways that I had asked for supernatural aid, going back to the hero's journey with Joseph Campbell, and I had been granted that aid. And it felt very powerful to me in solidifying a relationship with a higher power. And I had an experience a month later as well that was pretty powerful. We can go into that if you'd like, but that's kind of how the practice and how the archery experience went.
What was it that drove you to seek out the ayahuasca like camp before? You said it was just by coincidence that it worked out that way, but had you, up to that point, you'd already experimented with psychedelics, or was that your first experience of ayahuasca?
I had already experienced ayahuasca. I had already experienced other psychedelics. In retrospect, a big part of what made that experience super powerful was, for one, the shaman that I worked with is a true master, and I have since not found someone who's better at holding space. Also, a girlfriend and I were having some serious challenges at that time in our relationship, and so I was very in a vulnerable, somewhat insecure place, very open, receptive to that type of medicine. And then it was a men's retreat. It was meant to focus on men's work in a way, masculinity, what it means to be surrounded and supported by a group of men. And there were some pretty intense experiences that came with that. But in that quest for discovering my own masculinity, for defining it for myself, for finding it myself, that men's retreat was extra compelling to me.
You've sown the seeds now, so now I'm intrigued. What was the experience that came a month after your first hunt? I mean, obviously, it must have impacted you. Well, clearly, from what you've said, it impacted you in a very profound way, but to the point where you wanted to go and do it again?
Yes, and at the time back then, I was very much of the opinion that I could go do this work, but I didn't want to get too deep with it. The more one does it, well, I'll put it this way. There's certain people who are just called to it more than others. And there's certain people who are called to go deeper with it than others. And there's many different types of medicines. Like the same is true for hunting. And I've chosen to go very deep with that. I decided not to go very deep with meditation. So it's just kind of like this modality, and there's many different types of modalities, and people choose which one, and they identify with certain ones, and then they go deeper with it. And ayahuasca very much felt like it was a modality or practice that resonated with me. The first time was incredibly powerful. Then going on the hunt was powerful as well. And I got into this phase for a couple of basically the December where I had the hunt, and then leading up to the second ayahuasca experience where I was fascinated by death, and obviously partially related to the fact that I had just killed this animal.
Taken a life, yeah.
Yeah. And I remember reading The Denial of Death by Ernst Becker. I remember reading When Breath Becomes Air, which is
It's a fantastic book.
a beautiful book. And then there was another book, The Body Keeps the Score, that I was reading, which it's a psychologist whose hypothesis, and it's been pretty well proven by now, is that the body holds trauma. Trauma is not just held in the brain, it's actually in our body. And there was something about that book, something about the whole journey around death that seeded a lot of my experience going into the second ayahuasca retreat. So I went into the second ayahuasca retreat. I actually took the skin of the antelope that I had killed. So I had this skin. I still have it today. It still has the head on it and everything. It's generally makes non-hunters who have never seen a dead animal balk a little bit, which is part of the reason why I have it. But I took that with me, and I had some serious connection to that animal, and some serious spiritual. I remember at one point I was, and this all seems super real. I don't know if you've done ayahuasca or you know anyone who has.
I have not. I have zero experience of drugs outside of alcohol. Alcohol and nicotine and pharmaceuticals over the counter that everybody takes.
Yeah. So to put some context around this experience, when you go really deep, which I did, it creates such a vivid reality that it is reality. I mean, it is indistinguishable from your waking reality. And so in this state, at a very deep level, I remember myself, my current self, the dead version of me, the person who has already passed on into the next realm, and then this dead antelope. We were sitting on a porch. The antelope's near me. We're on rocking chairs. We're all just kind of connecting. And I was in this place of connection with the antelope, and given the book that I was reading about how the body holds trauma, I realized if I hold trauma in my body, then animals hold trauma in their body. And that realization made it very clear to me that I had no desire to eat the trauma of all the factory farmed animals that I was either participating in consciously or unconsciously. And so I made some commitments in that ayahuasca retreat that I was only going to eat meat that I either killed or caught or had some type of close relationship with, like a friend who killed it or something like that. And that commitment really forced me to deepen my practice in hunting. It forced me to really commit to more experiences, more learning, and it led to documentary opportunities. It led to a number of things, but it was a pretty profound, life-altering experience to make that commitment.
Yeah, that's amazing, the journey that you took to come to that realization. And I'm curious, before we go on, carry on talking about your hunting, but clearly, your experience was profoundly positive from what you've just described. But you were there with other people in the ayahuasca retreats. Was generally speaking, the experiences, were they positive for people?
Yeah, I have not met a single person who says that they do not want to lean further into doing ayahuasca because of how powerful it is. Now, don't get me wrong, there are people who the same day of the experience, they're like, I don't want anything to do with it. I've been there myself. There are people who go through some really tough, challenging things, and I have also been there myself. And it's not pleasant necessarily. It is considered work for a reason. However, when all the dust settles almost everybody that I've ever spoken to has had positive experiences when they've worked with the right set and setting. So the right shaman who's leading them, the right, comfortable, safe environment in order to do the work.
It's a world that I have no benchmark for, but it's intriguing and utterly fascinating. I have a very good friend who has described psychedelics to me in quite some length, but it's just interesting to hear another take.
Yeah, and for myself, I think one of the most impactful draws towards psychedelics is I approach both hunting, I approach my life, I approach almost everything through a lens of a kind of a nature-based spirituality that is very similar to indigenous cultures. And in fact, I have many relationships with indigenous cultures that inform my beliefs. And almost universally, these cultures utilize mind altering either plants or mushrooms or other substances. And so there's a lot of historical context for it. There's even a lot of interspecies context for it. Other species, almost every, there's many, many, many other species that alter their state of consciousness in order to interrupt the patterns that they're in, even though it's evolutionarily dangerous to do so. Like an animal who's tripping is ripe for being consumed and killed, but they do it because of how valuable it is for changing their patterns of their mind.
I'm imagining this kind of outer body experience as you're describing it to me, and but I guess it's something that you can't even come close to imagining unless you've actually experienced it.
Yeah, and there's other portals to it as well. I mean, I have completely blacked out and went to some crazy places literally just doing something called Kundalini yoga, which is basically breath work. So breath work can do it. There's many different ways without substances.
Interesting. Well, that's maybe there'll be people listening to this who are intrigued enough to go and dig more into it. But I'm conscious of the fact that we've talked for almost an hour already, and there's so much more that I want to speak to you about. So, tell me how your desire to carry on hunting moved on from that first experience, because we've only talked about your sort of first hunt, and as we started this podcast, you told me that your entire seasons looks like it's booked up, and you're going to be taking clients out. That seems a big jump from 2.5 years ago.
Yes, big jumps seem to be my forte. What happened is after I made the commitment that I did around the meat that I wanted to eat, I decided I need to hunt a bigger animal. I need to take it to the next level. And that's part of my personality as well. I probably could have just decided that I was going to hunt a bunch of whitetail in Texas and then just keep doing that over and over again and feed myself. But I decided I wanted to hunt for elk in the mountains. And again, part of what calls me to hunting is all of the development that can come as a human from that experience. So the idea of, yes, being in a blind, waiting for an animal, there's a certain reverence I have for that patience. There's a certain skill, and there's many positive attributes that come from that. And it's another experience to be hiking 50 miles up and down the mountain in order to kill an elk. And so I decided that I was going to do that at the end of my first year, basically a year after my first hunt. And again, back to a little bit of mystical, the person who was sitting next to me in the men's retreat for ayahuasca just so happens he was and is a Sundance award-winning filmmaker. So he's done
no way
many
cool.
great films. And he got to see the beginning of the journey. He visited town and he got to see the commitments that I was making, and he got to see that I was taking this journey to do an elk hunt, and he wanted to capture it in some way. And so really quickly, I raised $100,000 from some friends. We put together.
You raised $100,000 to make a doc?
To make a doc.
That's unreal. I'm not even going to let you just gloss over that. I mean, that's a serious feat to raise that amount of money to make a documentary. I mean, documentary filmmaking that's my day job. Is notoriously hard to get funding for, especially for something like that.
Yeah.
I'm impressed.
Well, thank you. I owe again. This is where it starts to, for me, become much bigger than me. As much as it is a feat, I'm very passionate. I'm very excited about things, and I think that that spills over into other people, and it can be highly influential. But at the same time as well, I was feeling that I was being supported. My spiritual teacher, his name's Will Starhart. He's 81. He's a Muskogee Creek teacher, and I've been working with him for 6 years. And he always tells me the plants chose you, Mansal. Like in the ayahuasca experiences, in that first hunt, it was the universe creating the experience that I would step into my dharma or my life's path, so to speak. And so when I raised that money, I very much saw that as, oh, this is divine intervention. This is like the universe conspiring for me, as the alchemist says. And so that led me to take it a step further. It led me to some meetings with some great people that I, never would have met with. It led me to speak with a group of my friends in Austin, Texas, about my experience. And this is kind of where things started to take off, is we raised the 100,000. I went on the elk hunt. We captured everything on film because Barlow is, artistic and he has to do something crazy like that. So we're traipsing around public land in Idaho with giant cameras and processing film in the middle of the woods. And I am speaking with my friends, and my friends are saying that they have never thought about hunting in the way that I'm describing it, and they've never wanted to hunt until I described it the way that I did. And so I set up a hunt for this group of my friends. It was 6 people, and for me, it was nothing more than creating a place for my friends to have this experience as well. And of course, I wanted to share it and I wanted to do it, but I didn't. I was following the desires and the ideas of other people in a way, and I guess that's kind of how all good businesses start. And that experience and the documentary, and then my personal practice, which, if you'll remember, I'm still trying to only eat meat that I kill. So there's a lot of personal hunting going on that's trying to make that happen, and fishing. And so it just kind of starts to snowball, and I start to really listen to what the path is in front of me. And it took a lot of time for me to step away from my old life. The old life was into supplements and health and fitness and all that kind of stuff. And to really step away from that into a whole new arena. It didn't come without challenges. It came with a lot of self-doubt, but within the past year, 2020, I've really stepped into it more fully. And again, another kind of cosmic thing that I would never have guessed, that just something small, like the domain sacredhunting.com. The fact that was available for $10 is so baffling to me that nobody would have registered that. But that is the brand, and that is where we are today, from very, very quick snowballing, that's for sure.
The hunting that you did for the elk, which got made into a documentary, is that something that's still ongoing, or is that doc out there?
It is still ongoing. We raised some more money, finished production, and now we're piecing together all the post-production.
Oh, right. So this is imminent. What are we talking, like 6 months or? Is that being
Well,
too optimistic?
yeah, the funding needs to come through, and it's a bit challenging to get it in the COVID environment.
Of course,
But
yeah.
we have the hardest stuff done, so I'm optimistic it'll be done at the right time. Again, I feel very much like I needed this time, I needed this delay in order to refine my experiences, in order to be able to fully step into this. And so I don't know when it'll come out, but I know it'll come out at the right time.
Cool. And are we talking sort of a feature-length documentary?
Yeah, feature length. I mean, I won't name, well, even if I name dropped, I don't think anyone would get it, but I'll name drop some of the films. I mean, we have like the post-production manager helped with Free Solo, the agent
Yep.
helped with Jiro Dreams of Sushi. We just got an EP that did some really, really, really big films that many people in your audience would have heard of. So
Cool.
I'm excited for the team, and I know it's imminent. It's just a matter of me being patient for when that time comes.
Incredible. And through this same time period, you also started a podcast because you're a podcaster too.
I am a podcaster.
Yeah. What made you to start that and pick it up as another medium to engage with people?
Well, I have a problem shutting up, first of all. And I like expressing myself. I like, more importantly, to share and to evaluate interesting ideas and interesting ways of being. And I think all of us have a desire to create at some level. And for some people, it might be creating in a piece of art, in a piece of music, in a piece of film, such as yourself. I like creating in a conversational way, in a evocative, thought-provoking kind of way. And that's really what my podcast is about. And as you know, it's just the Mansal Denton podcast. So it's just my name. It's broad enough where I get to explore a lot of different things. And for me, a fundamental piece, and this is one thing that hunting does so well for me, is I think we collectively, especially 2020, can feel that something about civilization feels kind of broken, the way that we relate to other humans, the way that we relate to the planet, the way that we relate to our time, our mortality. And that's what I wanted to explore with some really, deep thinkers. And so I've been blessed to have some amazing guests, and I feel like really excited when I get to listen to my own podcast, because it's very different when I'm asking questions. I'm trying to ask the best, most interesting questions. When I'm listening, I can just listen for content.
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. Sometimes, although I hate hearing myself back, obviously I edit them, so I have to listen to the podcast back to edit out, normally to take my fumbles out. But it's having that sort of second listen through from fantastic guests. I sort of, in a selfish way, that's part of the reason that I do it. I want to have these conversations so that they engage with the wider world, but it also gives me an excuse to speak with people that I might otherwise not have a reason to. And that sort of second listen through, when my brain isn't running ahead to try and work out how I carry a conversation forward, or what the next question might be, or what I want to dig into a little bit more, it really lets me sort of appreciate the gravity of some of the things that my guests have said. So I can totally appreciate that as well. And you've done some incredible deep dives into very emotional and important conversations with the guests that you've had on your podcast.
Yeah, I mean, really, really enjoyable conversations, really deep. In some ways, like attracts like. And so I think I've done a fairly good job of showing myself enough so that other people show up fully, and having conversations that have some substance to them. Not even just, the bigger guests like I've had, like Dennis McKenna or Charles Eisenstein, but even just some of the friends of mine, like Peter, who co-founded the men's group that I'm a part of, or, Jordan Reasoner, who's a backcountry hunter who you may know. We just had a really, deep conversation about what it means to hunt in the backcountry. And I'm like you said, I'm really I feel very privileged and grateful to have the podcast.
Just as I sort of get towards the end of this podcast and bring it to a close, I just wanted to draw back to something that you mentioned right at the start, because it seems very relevant to the current discussions being had in the sort of the outdoor space and the hunting community. And I mean, it couldn't be more relevant to the unrestlessness that's happening and the issues that are happening, particularly over in America right now, where you pointed out that growing up there was this certain uncomfortableness about the fact that you were half Indian, you were a person of color. In the outdoors space, how have you found that a barrier? Because I know that it's a question that has been raised in recent months for very obvious reasons, as it not being as welcoming as it can be, intended or not. What is your personal experience of been of that? I'm really curious to know if it's been a positive one, or whether you can give sort of feedback as to what that's been for you, especially coming into it like with your eyes wide open and very aware as somebody in your late 20s.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that my experience has been, for the most part, very positive. And I think one of the reasons for that is a shared camaraderie in understanding the world in a little bit different of a way than people who don't hunt. And in my experience, I remember a lot of my ex-girlfriend's family came from rural Arkansas, and there was some question about whether they would accept me. And one of the things that we connected on the most was hunting, because it was something that they did, something that they respected, and it was something that I was passionate about. And, race has always been something that's in my life, and it's been a process to work through it. And this isn't to say that every person of color experiences it this way, but I can have a situation where somebody may exhibit body language where they might not be too open to me, for example. And one of the stories that I go to pretty quickly, if their body language suggests they're not very receptive, or maybe they don't like me, I go to this story of they don't like me, they don't accept me, and it's because of my race that they don't accept me. And I have to stop myself, zoom out of that feeling, and recognize, one, I have no idea what they're experiencing. Their body language may say one thing, but I don't know what it actually means. Number two, even if they don't like me, I don't actually know that there's any ill will about my race. I've never asked anybody. And three, even if it did have something to do with my race, it says more about them than it says about me. And so I've been really conscious of my own victim narrative. And I think that a lot of people can fall into that if they haven't done enough, interpersonal work on their own relationship to race. And I'm not saying that racism doesn't happen, but you can imagine somebody who already questions their race because of, decades, hundreds of years of trauma. So they're already questioning their race. Then they come into an environment where maybe they're even more of a minority. It's very easy to simply feel that other people are racist, even when they're not. And so I very much take the approach that there's a lot of my own self-responsibility that comes into play when there's any kind of disparaging feelings around race. And I imagine that happens with other people. And I imagine there's also some racism in the hunting world. But, as far as people who are thought leaders in the space, I definitely don't experience it, and I imagine that kind of what's called in the literature, what's called internalized racism, is a factor as well.
I mean, yeah, I ask you for your experience because no one can be asked to sort of project what the experience of other people may or may not be. So, we can only ever speak of our own experiences of an activity or within a space or between other people. So I thought it was a really important question to ask just to see what your take on it was. From your own journey through it for the last couple of years. I do wonder though whether you think and I'm not even just talking about the hunting space here. I mean the outdoor space in general, whether more can be done to maybe break down barriers, even if they don't exist, if they are perceived barriers or this sort of notion that people of color are not wanted within that space, whether they actually exist or whether they're just a perception that they exist, it doesn't really matter. It's still a barrier. What more can be done to help level that and be more welcoming?
Well, I imagine there's some cultural overlap, some cultural it's almost like entanglement that happens in rural hunting culture and perhaps more class or race segmentation, so to speak. The hard part is that traditions and some old cultural way of doing things sometimes are, again, entangled with racist beliefs or even just prejudiced perspectives, and in ways that we don't even fully know. And, honestly, I don't feel that I'm in any kind of place to make any kind of recommendations for the hunting world or the outdoor world or anything like that. I'm new to it myself, but I can only speak for what I'm doing, and I do believe that to hear so much feedback from people who have never hunted before. Most, I would say 90% of the people that I facilitate hunting experiences for have never hunted before. And to do interviews with them after the fact, I've been doing like kind of market research type interviews to hear the phrasing that they use about hunting, like gun nuts, trophy hunters. Like there's so much of a perception around what hunting is, for better, for worse. And the approach that I bring to them resonates so much more with them that that's my little contribution to broadening the conversation, because I think that there's, at least in my experience, I can't speak to the race specifically, although I have had, people of other races and African Americans who have come to my experiences. The fact that they were shut off to hunting when it was represented to them in one way, but they were open to it when it was represented in a different way, is telling. And I imagine it's also telling to people of color who, confronted with a standard narrative around hunting, are not interested, and then introduced in some other way might be more interested. And, I mean, for me, the way that I approach it without going into too much detail is it's very emotional. It's very emotional. It's very emotional. It's very, in a lot of ways, it's very like spiritually oriented, connection oriented, and I think that that's something that everybody is seeking or interested in. And so it kind of it gets past certain walls in ways that, ATV riding, thermal scope night hunting doesn't do for the average person of color.
Yeah. I can the parallel that I can draw to that is that when my brother and I started filming like 4 or 5 years ago, when we started our company, we as a showcase for sort of filming skill and ability, we had no portfolio. So I'd been writing in the hunting industry for a long time, so I got some sponsorship together, and we filmed ourselves doing some hunting, and that was basically what started the company. But I tell you that because when those films went out over the sort of the next year that followed, we had a lot of people contacting us just through the website saying, we really love the way that you hunt, and we want to be able to experience hunting the way that you do. How can we do that? Where can we go? And there wasn't really anywhere, not at home, not where we lived. There wasn't anywhere that you could really do it like that. And so we started running hunting camps for small numbers of people, just a couple through the winter months, just focused on. We never did anything during any of the like the male part of the seasons. It was always during the female culling part of the season. So it was purely management and population control. And it was amazing how many people came to that because came to that with a narrative that they'd wanted to try it before, but they had never really found a way that they were comfortable doing it. And they liked this notion of being 100% responsible from the moment that you set foot out into the hills to the moment that you leave, and that it very much being about understanding the landscape and the populations that you are taking life from, and then taking that meat home and enjoying it. And in fact, we actually would eat a lot of meat in camp over the couple of days as well. And it really appealed to people on a different level and drew people into the hunting space who felt like they couldn't enter it with the other types of hunting that were available. And I think that also speaks to this somewhat unfortunate tribalism that there is within probably most outdoor recreation communities, but I can speak of like the hunting and fishing space, where one form of fishing or hunting, or if you're not hardcore enough or you prefer just to sit in tree stands, is seen as better in some way than another form of hunting, or you're less of a hunter, or you're less of a fisher, you're less of a person who enjoys nature if you don't if you're not prepared to graft for 14 days and nearly die by the time you get to the end of the hunt, which I think is bullshit. I think there's a lot of ways to appreciate it and enjoy it, and to try and exclude people because they don't somehow fit within your camp is very short-sighted, and I think says a lot about those people.
Yeah, I like to say that shadow, the part that we hide, repress, deny, it is something all of us have. Sometimes it shows up in different ways for different people, alcoholism, addiction, whatever the case is. But shadow gets its way into everything, and hunting is no different, unfortunately. And there are beautiful things of hunting, and there are beautiful role models such as yourself and your brother. And I'm a big fan of modern huntsmen. And there are obviously more shadowy type of behavior. And I confront it. I'm sure you confront it on a regular basis. And the only way that I've ever had any significant change on my parents, my friends, anybody that I love, that I want to see grow and evolve, has been by doing my own work and showing up as best as I can and as fully as I can in a way that inspires them. And so hopefully with conversations like this, with the work that both of us are doing independently, we can have that kind of an impact on them without needing to revert to the tribalism ourselves, and speak with some level of care and empathy to those perspectives as however we may deem them.
Mansal, that is a beautiful way to bring this podcast to a close. Thank you so much for taking the time out this evening. Well, it's this evening for me. It's probably the middle of the day for you. It's been an insightful and thoroughly enjoyable chat today, and I can't wait to bring this to everybody to listen. And if anybody wants to check out what you're doing, where are the best places? What are your social media handles and website and what have you?
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you for asking these questions and being open to a lot of the mythical sides of my story. And hopefully it's been compelling for the audience as well. Yeah, my handle on Instagram is at Mansal Denton. It's just my name, Mansal, and then Denton. And also people can find my whole organization, sacredhunting.com. And my podcast is the Mansal Denton Podcast. And I would love for people to go consume all the information, and if anything stands out or resonates, please feel free to reach out. I'm not that famous yet, so I can answer all of your questions.
Well, that's brilliant. I hope that at some point, when one day I'm allowed to freely travel to America again, when COVID decides to disappear back into the shadows that it came from, maybe you and I can meet up and hunt, or at least have a beer. I do get to Texas, and I have reasons to go back to Texas again as soon as I can. So that would be awesome.
I would love to see, brother.
And that's it for now. Join me again next time when we take another walk into the wilderness.